Lisbon was the golden gateway to a vast global empire.
Engineering marvels rose to defy the limits of the era.
But beneath the opulence, a silent shadow began to loom.
By the 1740s, Lisbon had become one of the wealthiest and most opulent cities in all of Europe. A crowded port shaped by overseas trade, by the gold arriving from Brazil, and by a court that lived between religious devotion and Baroque ostentation. In less than 2 decades, this city would be shaken by a catastrophe that would reduce it to rubble and ashes, forcing it to be rebuilt from its very foundations. In this video, I use modern artificial intelligence tools to bring historic paintings, maps, and engravings to life, shifting perspectives, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original artists could never have imagined. The goal is not just to look at the past, but to step into it. To walk through Lisbon as it once was, and imagine what it must have been like to stand here at the height of its wealth before everything changed. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has transformed and what still remains. Before we set foot in Old Lisbon, it helps to understand how this city came to be what it was at that time. Portugal had built a maritime empire that stretched from Brazil to the coasts of Africa, from India to the islands of the Pacific. The riches of that empire flowed into Lisbon, turning the capital into the beating heart of a global trade. Gold from Minas Gerais arrived in bars and coins. Diamonds sparkled in the coffers of the aristocracy. Spices from the Orient perfumed the warehouses of the Ribeira. It was a city where wealth was displayed without shame, where churches competed in splendor, and where King John V spent fortunes on constructions that would rival those of Rome. The view that unfolds before us shows Lisbon from the Tagus River, just as it would have been seen by sailors returning from long ocean voyages. The Terreiro do Paço dominates the scene, a great square open to the water that served as the political and commercial heart of the city. Here stood the Paço da Ribeira, the royal palace that had been the residence of Portuguese monarchs for more than 250 years. Originally built by order of King Manuel I at the end of the 15th century, the palace had been expanded and transformed over the centuries, acquiring an imposing tower that dominated the Lisbon skyline. From its windows, kings could watch the coming and going of ships that brought the riches of the empire. The Terreiro do Paço was much more than a simple square. It was the stage where coronation ceremonies were held, where nobles strolled, displaying their finest attire, where merchants closed deals, and where common people came to witness the spectacles that the court organized. Next to the royal palace stood the Casa da Índia, the administrative heart of Portuguese trade with the Orient. Here were registered the goods arriving from Goa, from Macau, from the Spice Islands. Officials kept meticulous accounts of the pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg that filled the holds of the ships. The alfândega processed imports and exports, collecting the taxes that financed the crown. In the warehouses of the Ribeira das Naus accumulated exotic woods from Brazil, fine fabrics from the Orient, porcelains from China. For merchants from all over Europe, Lisbon was a gateway to a world of products they could not find anywhere else. Imagine arriving at this port after months of sailing across the Atlantic. The Tagus River opens like an inland sea, so wide that the opposite shore seems like a hazy line on the horizon. Anchored ships sway gently, their masts forming a forest of wood and rope. Small boats come and go carrying passengers and goods. The noise of the docks floats across the water, a mixture of stevedores shouting, the thump of crates being unloaded, the neighing of horses waiting at the quay. And dominating it all, the silhouette of the city spreading across the hills, with its churches, its palaces, its convents whitewashed by the sun. King Joseph I, who had ascended to the throne in 1750, was passionate about opera and the performing arts. By his order, one of the most sumptuous theatres in Europe was built next to the royal palace. The Opera do Terreiro, also known as the Real Casa da Opera, was inaugurated in March of 1755, just 7 months before disaster would wipe it from the map. The theatre had capacity for 600 people, distributed between the stalls and 38 boxes. The spectators, according to accounts from the time, would get distracted from the stage because their eyes were dazzled by the richness of the house, which was white and with much gold in ornaments. The project had been commissioned from the Italian architect Giovanni Carlo Cicinio Galli Bibbiena, one of the most celebrated theatre designers of his time. The inauguration was celebrated with the opera Alessandro nell'Indy, with music by David Perez, in a spectacle that combined the monumentality of the sets with rich special effects. The cast included some of the greatest international stars of the era. No one imagined then that this magnificent theatre would have such a brief life. Climbing from the Terreiro do Paço toward the interior of the city, the streets narrowed and twisted, following the medieval layout that Lisbon had inherited from previous centuries. The Baixa, as the lower part of the city was known, was a labyrinth of narrow streets where artisan shops, taverns, and tenement houses were crammed together. Buildings leaned toward each other, their upper floors advancing over the street until they almost touched. On rainy days, one could walk almost without getting wet by jumping from one doorway to another. Commerce bustled at every corner. Goldsmiths worked gold and silver brought from Brazil. Tailors cut fabrics imported from England and France. Shoemakers, hatters, candle makers, each trade had its street or its neighborhood. On the hill overlooking the Baixa rose the Convento do Carmo, one of the most imposing Gothic buildings in the city. Founded in 1389 by Dom Nuno Álvares Pereira, the great military commander who had secured Portugal's independence from Castile, the convent had been for centuries one of the most important religious centers in Lisbon. The Church of Carmo competed in monumentality with the cathedral itself. Its high Gothic naves, its pointed arches, its ribbed vaults represented the power and devotion of an earlier age. The Carmelite monks who lived in the convent led lives of prayer and contemplation, oblivious to the changes that lay ahead. Dom Nuno Álvares Pereira himself had entered the convent in his later years, renouncing worldly glories to seek peace of spirit. Not far from Carmo, descending toward the east, lay one of the oldest neighborhoods in Lisbon. Alfama had been the heart of the city during Arab rule, and its name derived from the Arabic al-Hama, meaning hot spring. Its labyrinthine streets, steep staircases, and cramped houses preserved something of the atmosphere of a medieval Medina. After wealthier residents moved west during the Middle Ages, Alfama had become a neighborhood of fishermen and sailors. Its inhabitants lived close to the river on which they depended for their livelihood. In the mornings, women went down to wash clothes at the public fountains. In the afternoons, men mended their nets in the doorways of their houses. It was a humble but vital neighborhood, where community life took place in the streets and squares, where everyone knew their neighbors, and where traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Dominating Alfama from above stood the Castelo de São Jorge, the ancient fortress that had protected the city for centuries. Originally built by the Moors, the castle had been conquered by the Christians in 1147 and had served as a royal residence until the monarchs moved to the Paço da Ribeira. From its walls one could contemplate the entire city stretching westward. The Tagus River gleaming in the sun, ships anchored in the port, hills covered with white buildings. It was a place laden with history, where every stone seemed to hold the memory of past battles and victories. Next to Alfama stood the Sé de Lisboa, the oldest cathedral in the city. Built in the 12th century on the remains of an ancient mosque, The Sé combined Romanesque elements with Gothic and Baroque additions that had accumulated over the centuries. According to tradition, it was in this cathedral that Saint Anthony, the most popular saint of Lisbon, had been baptized. Its thick stone walls, its twin towers, its rose window gave the cathedral the appearance of a fortress, as if it had been built both to defend the faith and to celebrate it. Inside, the darkness of the naves contrasted with the brilliance of the gilded altars, where candles burned perpetually before the images of the saints. If from the center of the city we head west, following the banks of the Tagus, we arrive at the neighborhood of Belém. Here, at some distance from the urban core, stood some of the most emblematic monuments of Portugal. The Mosteiro dos Jerónimos had been ordered built by King Manuel I at the beginning of the 16th century to commemorate the return of Vasco da Gama from his voyage to India. The monastery was an extraordinary example of the Manueline style, that Portuguese variant of late Gothic that incorporated maritime elements and motifs inspired by overseas discoveries. Ropes carved in stone, shells, armillary spheres, crosses of the Order of Christ decorated the cloisters and facades. Inside the church rested the remains of Vasco da Gama and Luís de Camões, the poet who had sung the glories of Portuguese discoveries in Os Lusíadas. The Hieronymite monks who inhabited the monastery were known for their hospitality to travelers, and according to tradition, they were the ones who created the original recipe for the famous pastéis de Belém. Near the monastery, extending into the waters of the Tagus, stood the Torre de Belém. Built between 1514 and 1519, the tower had originally served as a defensive outpost to protect the entrance to the port of Lisbon. Its architecture combined military elements with the rich ornamentation of the Manueline style. Decorated balconies, turrets with onion-shaped domes, shields and crosses covered its walls. For navigators departing for unknown lands, the Torre de Belém was the last image of Portugal they carried in their eyes. For those returning after long voyages, it was the first sign that home was near. Imagine the emotion of spotting this tower after months of sailing, knowing that you would soon set foot on solid ground, that you would soon embrace your loved ones. Returning toward the center of the city, we cannot fail to mention one of the most impressive engineering works of the era. The Aqueduto das Águas Livres had been ordered built by King John V to solve the eternal problem of the shortage of drinking water in Lisbon. Although the Tagus bordered the city, its waters were too brackish for consumption due to the influence of ocean tides. For centuries, Lisboetas had depended on wells and natural springs, which often proved insufficient. Construction of the aqueduct began in 1731, and the work was inaugurated in 1748, although work would continue for decades more. The most spectacular section was the arcade crossing the Valley of Alcântara, composed of 35 arches extending for almost 1 kilometer. The largest arch, at 65 meters high, was the largest pointed stone arch in the world. From the mine d'Agua Velha, near Belas, water flowed by gravity along 14 kilometers until reaching the reservoir at Amoreiras, in the heart of Lisbon. From there, it was distributed to dozens of public fountains, where water carriers filled their jugs to bring water to the houses of the city. The Lisbon of the 1740s was also a city of extreme contrasts. Alongside the opulence of palaces and churches existed a poverty hidden in alleys and lower neighborhoods. Beggars asked for alms at church doors. Slaves brought from Africa and Brazil served in the houses of the wealthy. The Inquisition still held auto da fe in the Rocio, though less frequently than in previous centuries. Epidemics of plague and other diseases periodically decimated the population. Infant mortality was extremely high, life expectancy was short. But for those fortunate enough to belong to the privileged classes, Lisbon offered a life of refinement and pleasures. Ladies of the aristocracy wore imported silks and jewels. gentlemen showed off their carriages and servants. Salons filled with music and conversation, theatre, opera, bullfights attracted crowds. It was a society that lived intensely, perhaps sensing that the wheel of fortune could turn at any moment. The Rossio, the great square extending north of the Baixo, was one of the most important public spaces in the city. Here were held fairs, markets, popular festivals. Here were erected platforms for bullfights and scaffolds for public executions. The Inquisition had held its autos da fe in this square for centuries, though in the 18th century such spectacles were already less frequent. At one end of the Rossio stood the Hospital de Todos os Santos, one of the largest hospitals in Europe, which treated thousands of patients each year. At the other end, the Convento de São Domingos dominated the square with its austere facade. Between them, the daily life of Lisbon bustled with its mix of merchants, artisans, clergy, nobles, beggars and foreigners from all nations. Climbing the steep streets toward the west, one reached the Bairro Alto, a neighborhood that had been planned in the 16th century with a more regular street layout than the old city. Here lived artisans, merchants of moderate fortune, some professionals. The houses were more modest than the palaces of the aristocracy, but had a certain air of bourgeois dignity. At night, the taverns of Bairro Alto filled with patrons who came to drink wine and converse. It was a neighborhood that already then had a reputation for being bohemian, where nightlife stretched into the late hours. Now I want to bring you into the present and show you how these places look today. Thanks for being here, and if you have ideas or suggestions for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. The Terreiro do Paço no longer exists, as the Lisboetas of the 18th century knew it. After the earthquake, the Marquis of Pombal ordered the construction of a new square in the same place, the current Praça do Comércio. Where the royal palace once stood, there are now administrative buildings with uniform facades, painted in the characteristic Pombaline yellow. The tower has disappeared, but a triumphal arch marks the entrance to the city from the river. The square remains one of the most important public spaces in Lisbon, frequented by tourists and locals who come to stroll by the water. The Ópera do Terreiro was completely destroyed and was never rebuilt. However, some recent research suggests that parts of its structure were used in the construction of the Navy Arsenal building, which today occupies approximately the same location. The Teatro Nacional de São Carlos, inaugurated in 1793, took over as Lisbon's main opera house. The ruins of the Convento do Carmo remain as one of the most moving testimonies of the earthquake. The church was never rebuilt, and its Gothic arches rise today open to the sky, creating a scene of romantic melancholy that so pleased the aesthetes of the 19th century. Inside operates the Museu Arqueológico do Carmo, the first art and archaeology museum in Portugal. Alfama survived the earthquake thanks to the solidity of its foundations and its location on the highest hills of the city. Today it remains one of the most picturesque neighborhoods in Lisbon. With its labyrinthine streets, its houses with laundry hanging in the windows, its taverns where fado can still be heard. It is like a small medieval village preserved in the heart of a modern capital. The Mosteiro dos Jerónimos and the Torre de Belém barely suffered damage in the earthquake, probably because Belém was further from the epicenter. Today, both monuments are UNESCO World Heritage Sites and receive millions of visitors each year. The monastery houses museums and remains a symbol of the Portuguese age of discoveries. The Aqueduto das Águas Livres also survived the earthquake unscathed, testimony to the quality of its construction. It continued to supply water to Lisbon until 1968. Today, it is possible to walk along some sections of the aqueduct and contemplate from above a unique view of the city. The Baixia we know today is completely different from the one that existed before the earthquake. The narrow and winding streets were replaced by a regular grid of wide and straight streets, flanked by uniform buildings of the same height. This is the so-called Baixia Pombalina, one of the first examples of Enlightenment urbanism in Europe, designed to be resistant to future earthquakes and to facilitate commerce and circulation. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.